Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Some 911 calls crackle with panic. This one started with silence. March 12th, 2025. A quiet neighborhood in West Houston. Just after 7:20 a.m., a man stood still outside a two-story home on Emma Forest Street. His hands were raised in the air. His clothes were saturated with dried blood. The officer who approached first noted the man's stillness. No shouting, no signs of resistance, just a blank stare and blood on his forearms, shirt, and sneakers. That man was identified as Chance Chavez, 34. And inside that house, just steps away from where he stood motionless, lay the body of Kristen Chavez, 32. She was found in the primary bedroom, positioned near the foot of the bed. She had blunt force trauma to her head and upper face, consistent with repetitive high-impact blows. Near her body was a household steam iron, broken in two, blood spattered, and later confirmed to be the murder weapon. The crime scene offered no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no pried locks. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong, and that silence from the initial 911 call, it echoed throughout the case. Responding officers documented the scene quickly. Kristen's body showed no signs of recent defensive wounds, suggesting she may have been caught off guard. A trail of transfer blood indicated movement from the body's original position to where it was found. That detail would later prove central to reconstructing the timeline of what happened. The medical examiner arrived on scene shortly after 9:01 a.m. Based on lividity and temperature, time of death was estimated between 5 a.m. and 6:30 a.m., hours before the 911 call was placed. The fact that Chance Chavez remained at the residence, made the call himself, and didn't attempt to flee would later be used by his defense counsel as evidence of cooperation. But to investigators, the delay raised an immediate red flag. Harris County deputies began a preliminary canvass of the neighborhood. Neighbors were mostly unaware of what had happened. Several reported hearing dogs barking early that morning. Not uncommon. No one reported screams, thuds, or shouting. Body camera footage later confirmed that all four of Kristen's dogs were missing from the home at the time of police entry. The lack of overt chaos at the scene was unsettling. A woman had died violently inside a home. Her husband was covered in blood. Yet nothing about the initial environment indicated struggle. No broken lamps, no signs of struggle in the hallway or entry points. Just one room, one weapon, and one body. Inside the master bedroom, investigators found additional evidence. Droplets of blood consistent with impact spatter along the nearby wall, consistent with blunt force injuries. The patterning on the wall was close range, less than 2 feet from the point of impact. And the downward angle of the spatter suggested Kristen may have been kneeling or on the ground during the blows. On a nearby dresser sat a charging iPhone, which was removed for digital forensics. The screen was locked, but analysis would later reveal unread text messages from the night before. One of them, time-stamped at 11:14 p.m., read, "I can't sleep. Something feels off tonight." Downstairs on the kitchen counter, officers noted a set of car keys, a laptop with the lid open, and a printed document from a local loan office, partially crumpled. It was a rejected loan application, denied due to insufficient collateral. The amount requested, $1 million, the applicant, Kristen Chavez. That detail wasn't public yet, and it would raise critical questions. Why was Kristen applying for a business loan that large? And why had the form been filled out by hand, yet signed in a signature her sister would later testify looked nothing like Kristen's? By mid-morning, Chance Chavez had been taken into custody for questioning. He did not request a lawyer immediately, but offered little in the way of explanation. According to the incident report, he told investigators, "I woke up, she wasn't breathing. I called 911. That's all." When asked why there were signs of impact wounds and defensive repositioning, he reportedly answered, "I tried to move her. I didn't know what else to do." A forensic pathologist would later challenge that statement. The amount of force used and the angle of the trauma made it extremely unlikely that the wounds were accidental or that Kristen had fallen. Within 24 hours, the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and face, with contributing injuries to the cervical spine. The injuries were described as inconsistent with a household fall, and most likely inflicted with intentional, repeated blunt force. Investigators also located blood residue on the handle of the iron, inside Chance's right front pocket, and smeared faintly along the hallway doorframe. A single dog paw print in dried blood was found near the back patio door, suggesting at least one of Kristen's dogs had stepped through the aftermath before being removed from the scene. Security footage from surrounding homes was requested. None of the homes directly next door had working external cameras. A neighbor across the street provided partial footage from a doorbell cam. It showed a vehicle matching Kristen's SUV exiting the driveway at approximately 6:52 a.m., then returning at 7:18 a.m. In that 26-minute window, 4 dogs were dumped near Katy Freeway. Only 3 were found alive. The first major forensic layer was in place. Time of death, weapon confirmation, injury pattern, and digital timestamps misaligned with the suspect's initial timeline. And yet the motive was still murky. If this was a spontaneous act of violence, why the delay in calling 911? If this was an accident, why remove the dogs, clean parts of the home, and dispose of a pet in a manner described by investigators as deliberate concealment? And if Kristen Chavez had recently expressed fear, as suggested by those text messages, what was she afraid of? These weren't abstract questions. They were evidentiary gaps. And in cases like this, they either get sealed by the truth or exploited by defense. Kristen Chavez wasn't famous. She didn't have a public profile or a career in politics or media, but in any homicide investigation, victimology matters. Understanding who the victim was, her daily routines, relationships, digital footprint, and vulnerabilities can often reveal more than the crime scene itself. Kristen was not invisible to those who knew her, but she was overlooked in all the wrong ways. Born in 1992, Kristen grew up in a suburb north of Houston. She attended Cypress Woods High School, later graduating from the University of Houston with a degree in accounting. She worked as a financial coordinator for a local logistics company. Small firm, no red flags, steady job. Co-workers described her as reliable, soft-spoken, and structured. She arrived on time. She didn't overshare. She didn't bring drama to work. Her closest friends described her as private but emotionally consistent. She wasn't withdrawn, but she didn't easily volunteer details about her marriage. One coworker recalled that Kristen often deflected questions about her weekend plans, replying with phrases like, "just catching up on house stuff," or "we'll probably stay in." Kristen had no children, but she had 4 dogs, all small breeds. They were vaccinated, registered with the city, and regularly groomed. Vet records showed she took them in every quarter. To outsiders, this detail might seem trivial, but to her inner circle, those dogs were deeply meaningful. She referred to them as her kids and often included them in holiday cards. Investigators would later note that all 4 animals were microchipped in her name only. She wasn't active on Facebook or Instagram. Her digital presence was minimal. No political posts, no vacation photos, no relationship milestones. However, forensic extraction from her iPhone revealed she used messaging apps frequently, especially WhatsApp and Signal. Her last active use was around 11:17 p.m. on March 11th, approximately 6 hours before the estimated time of death. Among those final messages was a short text to a close friend. "If I go silent, it's because I don't want to make things worse." That message, though vague, aligned with a growing pattern investigators would discover. Subtle indicators of stress, control, and possibly psychological manipulation within her marriage. Investigators subpoenaed Kristen's Google account. Location history confirmed she rarely left the house outside work hours. Forensic timeline tools placed her at home throughout the evening of March 11th. Her Uber Eats account showed a single food order placed at 7:03 p.m. that night, delivered without issue. Security logs from the delivery app showed no indication of third-party tampering or suspicious activity. The order had been placed from her own device, authenticated by fingerprint. Emails collected from her work account suggested a normal professional day on the 11th. No HR complaints, no flag behavior. Her browser history showed searches for business grant options for women, personal loan calculator, and exit strategy marriage finance. The latter query, time-stamped at 10:42 p.m., was the final recorded web activity before the device went inactive. From a procedural standpoint, this was the second forensic layer: victim lifestyle and digital intent. Kristen's financial records further revealed something else. A joint checking account had been opened 1 year prior, but over the last 6 months, it had been drained via small daily cash withdrawals, mostly at gas stations and ATMs in non-traceable intervals. All PIN entries matched a card registered in her name, but the frequency suggested either loss of control over her finances or coercion. When speaking with Kristen's older sister, investigators learned Kristen had mentioned concern about a loan issue the week before her death. She had been approached to co-sign something, but didn't feel comfortable doing it. Her sister remembered Kristen saying, "I'm not sure it's legal, but he said it's only temporary." That loan turned out to be the $1 million rejected application recovered at the crime scene, though the application listed Kristen Chavez as the borrower. Handwriting analysis and signature comparison revealed inconsistencies. Kristen's known legal signature on her driver's license and previous tax forms didn't match the document. A forensic document analyst retained by Harris County confirmed the form had been signed by someone else, though no official charges of forgery had been filed at the time of this report. 1 week before her death, Kristen scheduled a private consultation with a local attorney who specialized in marital asset protection and exit planning. The appointment was set for March 13th at 9 a.m. She never made it. There's no evidence Kristen planned to report abuse, no restraining orders, no police complaints, but her behavior showed a person quietly positioning herself for change. And that's often the window where victims become most vulnerable. Not when they stay, but when they prepare to leave. Her digital fingerprint reinforced the theory. She had set up a secondary email address, created a basic document titled Plan A Budget Outline, and initiated the early steps of a solo bank account setup. These weren't public actions. They were private shifts, but they were deliberate. By the end of March 13th, investigators had enough to map Kristen Chavez's recent behavioral patterns. She was financially methodical, cautious with communication, and quietly researching how to untangle herself from a life she no longer controlled. The direction of the inquiry narrowed. Motive likely stemmed from escalating financial tension. She was planning a transition, one she would not live to complete. In cases like this, one investigator noted off-record, "We're not looking for the scream. We're looking for the silence before it." To understand the events of March 12, 2025, investigators needed to dissect not just the crime scene, but the person who had lived beside Kristen Chavez, day in and day out, for nearly 6 years. The person who made the 911 call, the person whose clothes were soaked in blood, and whose story never quite lined up with what the forensic evidence told. Chance Zane Chavez was 34 at the time of the incident. No prior criminal convictions, no documented domestic abuse history. On paper, he was clean, but deeper scrutiny revealed patterns that don't always appear in background checks. He had worked in light industrial contracting, framing and concrete mostly, in the Northwest Houston area. Public employment records showed an inconsistent work history over the past decade. W-2 records indicated multiple job changes and extended gaps in employment. His last reported full-time position ended in November 2024. According to unemployment filings, he had cited company restructuring as the reason for separation. But his former employer, contacted by detectives, provided a different explanation: repeated no-shows and unresolved conflict with supervisors. In January 2025, Chavez applied for a personal business loan in the amount of $1,000. The application, filed through a mid-tier Houston financial firm, listed his intended business as a residential remodeling consultancy. However, there was no business license associated with his name, and no EIN had been registered. He listed Kristen Chavez as the primary borrower and guarantor. When asked during the application process about his financial contribution, he marked pending spousal asset transfer. The loan was denied. At the time of Kristen's death, Chavez had no steady income, no registered business, and had recently defaulted on 2 credit accounts opened in his name. Total outstanding debt exceeded $54,000. This financial context became crucial when investigators began analyzing motive. The pressure wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Chavez was facing declining credit, no viable job prospects, and had recently failed to secure a fast capital solution through his spouse. But motive alone isn't enough. Investigators needed sequence, timeline, discrepancy. Digital forensics from Chavez's own phone, seized at the time of questioning, revealed search history entries that conflicted with his original account. While he had stated in his initial statement that he woke up and found Kristen unresponsive, geolocation logs showed he had left the house between 6:41 a.m. and 7:14 a.m. during the critical window after Kristen's estimated time of death, but before the 911 call at 7:21 a.m. In that gap, his cell tower pings placed him along Interstate 10, roughly 3 miles from the home. Traffic camera footage would later confirm the presence of a white Hyundai SUV consistent with Kristen's vehicle in that location, later returning to the property. Inside the SUV, recovered days later, officers found hair and dried biological residue on the rear seat floor mat. Canine DNA tests confirmed that the residue belonged to one of Kristen's missing dogs. 3 of the 4 dogs had been located at various locations off Katy Freeway. One, Peaches, had been found deceased, zipped into a black garbage bag with no collar. According to veterinary records, Peaches had been microchipped to Kristen and was seen at a wellness visit just 3 weeks prior. The intentional relocation and disposal of the animals added another layer to the case. These weren't the actions of a man panicked over a sudden tragedy. They were deliberate, timed, calculated. Whether an attempt to destroy emotional evidence, control a narrative, or eliminate witnesses in the simplest sense, removing the dogs removed noise, movement, traces. What it did not remove, however, was intent. Chavez's bank statements obtained by subpoena showed recent ATM withdrawals in odd, rounded increments, $100 here, $80 there, primarily between midnight and 4:00 a.m. Over the last 6 weeks before Kristen's death, over $3,400 had been withdrawn in cash. None of the vendors listed included business-related expenses, no building materials, no travel expenses, just withdrawals followed by near-zero account balances. Kristen's own accounts reflected a different trend. She had been actively consolidating her savings, moving small amounts into a new account with a different institution, one Chavez had no access to. That account, opened discreetly in late February, showed growing deposits and a setup for auto transfer of her next paycheck, scheduled for March 15th. It was never received. Detectives also reviewed Chavez's email communications. In the days leading up to March 12th, there were no messages sent from his account that hinted at planning or conspiracy, but one draft email, recovered from the deleted folder, was time-stamped March 9th. Its subject line, "For Kristen," the body simply read, "I'm sorry for the way this ends, but I can't go back to nothing." The email had not been sent. Despite his insistence during questioning that he had no idea what happened, digital timestamps, location history, and banking activity contradicted the version of events he provided. It didn't require a confession. The trail of behavior told its own story. Still, Chavez remained legally presumed innocent. As the case built layer by layer, prosecutors would need more than circumstantial contradiction. They would need physical proof, behavioral consistency, and psychological insight. The defense, no doubt, would argue stress, confusion, even disassociation. But the facts remained. A man facing rising financial pressure, a woman preparing to leave, a rejected loan dependent on her cooperation, a mourning timeline that no longer made sense. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The decision to move a body tells investigators something, but the decision to remove animals, especially when those animals were microchipped, well cared for, and known to be emotionally significant to the victim, signals something more intentional, more controlled, less impulsive. In the Kristen Chavez investigation, the movement of her 4 dogs in the hours surrounding her death didn't just complicate the crime scene, it reframed the suspect's behavior after the estimated time of death. 3 of the dogs were found alive. Each had been abandoned at separate off-ramps along Katy Freeway, roughly 2 to 5 miles west of the Chavez residence. The discovery was staggered. The first was picked up by an independent rescuer who posted on a local pet recovery group. The second was scanned for a chip at a nearby vet clinic. The third was located by Harris County Animal Services after being spotted near a drainage culvert. All three dogs were registered under Kristen's name. All were chipped. All were dropped in public accessible locations where they would likely be found. The fourth dog, a dachshund named Peaches, was found dead. Her body had been wrapped in a standard black lawn bag and dumped near a grassy shoulder off the westbound side of the freeway. The bag was tied at both ends. Inside, the remains showed early decomposition, and the autopsy conducted by a veterinary pathologist later concluded death by suffocation, not trauma. Peaches had no broken bones, no visible blunt force wounds. The determination she had likely been alive when placed in the sealed bag. The presence of biological fluid inside the bag, mostly saliva and high-stress enzyme traces, supported that conclusion. She had likely panicked, scratched, eventually asphyxiated. When police recovered Peaches, the location of the dump site matched cell tower data from the suspect's phone, placing him at that exact exit ramp at 6:56 a.m., 25 minutes before the 911 call was placed. This was not a rushed disposal of a pet after a domestic tragedy. It was timed. The removal and distribution of the animals took planning and required multiple stops. Total time spent between home and final return, 33 minutes. A logical route, efficient. Surveillance from a nearby gas station, located 1 block from the first dog drop point, showed a white SUV consistent with Kristen's vehicle entering and exiting the lot within a 2-minute window at 6:43 a.m. That vehicle had dark-tinted rear windows and a roof dent visible in previously taken DMV photos of the Chavez household car. The implication here wasn't just that the suspect moved the animals, it's that he knew which ones would likely survive and which one wouldn't. Peaches, the smallest and least likely to remain calm when released in open traffic, was the only one sealed in a bag. That decision suggests a functional awareness of how the dogs might behave when dropped. It also suggests intention in what to leave visible and what to eliminate. When investigators mapped the drop sites, a pattern emerged. The 3 live dogs were spaced roughly equidistant apart, westward from the home, with drop times estimated based on footage and mobile ping data between 6:38 and 6:57 a.m. The placement was linear, efficient, and suggested pre-selected locations with minimal surveillance coverage. Forensic analysis of the vehicle interior showed trace blood, both canine and human, on the rear seat panel. Swabs confirmed Kristen's DNA as well as mitochondrial DNA matching Peaches. There was no visible damage to the upholstery, no sign of struggle, but behind the passenger seat, in the floor mat crease, investigators retrieved a small plastic tag, the kind typically clipped to a pet collar after a rabies vaccination. It was marked with Kristen's vet clinic in the year 2024. Taken in isolation, the dog disposal may appear secondary to the central crime, but within the behavioral framework, it represents an important forensic angle: post-homicide decision-making. It speaks to mindset, control, and risk management. And perhaps most critically, it interrupts any claim of emotional shock or dissociation. The suspect didn't freeze. He didn't flee. He acted. And he acted in a way that suggests not panic, but procedure. As forensic teams reassembled the movement timeline, the logic became clearer. By removing the dogs before the emergency call, the suspect minimized potential distractions and removed variables that could trigger concern or sympathy. The animal's absence also reduced noise. No barking during the call, no movement in the home, no contradictory behavior. In short, it silenced the house. There is also the symbolic layer, one that law enforcement tends to note, but rarely put into charging documents. Kristen's dogs weren't just pets. They were the one aspect of her life that appeared entirely hers. Financial records showed she alone paid for their care. She listed them in her emergency contact form at work. Her sister confirmed Kristen refused to vacation without arranging care in person. Removing the dogs removed the last part of Kristen's independence from the house. A prosecutor might not build a case around that, but an investigator takes note of what gets erased. By the end of March 13, 2025, the forensic report from the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences was complete. Kristen Chavez had not died in her sleep. She had not fallen in the bathroom. She had not suffered a medical event. What killed her, definitively, mechanically, was blunt force trauma to the head and upper face. There was nothing ambiguous about it. The autopsy detailed at least 4 distinct impact zones to the frontal and parietal regions of Kristen's skull. The wounds were consistent in size and angle. Each blow was forceful enough to cause intracranial bleeding. 2 of them left hairline fractures with radiating fissures, injuries not commonly caused by a household fall. The pathologist ruled out accidental trauma within minutes. The object used in the attack was recovered just 3 feet from the body. A broken steam iron, standard household model. One edge of the iron's metal base plate was bent inward. Blood and epithelial tissue were present along the inner rim. Latent print analysis found partial friction ridge patterns, but none of them were clear enough for a direct match. Investigators secured the item anyway. It was no longer about proving what caused the injury, but establishing control and access. Kristen had no signs of defensive wounds, no bruises on her forearms, no injuries to the palms or fingers, no abrasions on the knees or elbows. The absence of self-protection marks suggested she hadn't fought back, not because she wasn't capable, but because she hadn't been given the chance. The body was discovered on the floor beside the bed, but blood pattern analysis on the wall and baseboard told a different story. Spatter projected at a 25-30 degree downward angle, indicating she was struck while kneeling or seated. Analysts traced fine impact mist along a 1.2-meter arc, originating at head level when seated. These aren't the details shown in courtroom sketches, but they matter. They show sequencing. Kristen had likely been conscious during the first blow. Additional forensic evidence came from her smartwatch, worn daily and recovered at the scene. The biometric data showed a resting heart rate between 64-72 BPM until 5:48 a.m. At 5:49, it spiked abruptly to 121. At 5:51, it flatlined. That 2-minute window matched the ME's estimate for time of death. The watch had stopped syncing at 6:03 a.m. when it was manually disconnected from her phone. That's not an accidental act. It's the removal of a digital witness. On Kristen's phone, found charging on the dresser, the last unlocked activity showed a banking app accessed at 11:11 p.m. the night before. No activity after that. The phone remained untouched until law enforcement arrived. Yet the watch had been unpaired manually that morning. Someone had gone into the phone's Bluetooth settings and severed the connection. In homicide investigations, silence from devices can be as revealing as activity. The removal of a link between the victim's body and her phone was an intentional step. It didn't erase data. It interrupted continuity. That's forensic intent, not chance. When law enforcement re-entered the home later for a second pass, they noticed one additional anomaly. The bedding on the master bed was clean, but wrinkled. Not bloodied, but a small trace, less than 1 centimeter wide, was found on the underside of the flat sheet. DNA confirmed it was Kristen's. The theory, she was struck once on the bed and again after falling to the floor. That possibility was supported by a faint smear, low on the headboard, not visible at first glance, matching the height of a seated adult. None of these details stood alone as headline material, but together they established a quiet precision, the kind that contradicts panic, the kind that demonstrates control, even after violence. This wasn't the chaos of a struggle. It was sequencing, deliberate action, cleanup, and containment. And while motive was still being argued in the background, the mechanism of death was no longer in question. What remained was a chilling certainty. Kristen didn't die in a moment of spontaneous rage. She died in silence within a limited window by the hands of someone who took steps not to flee, but to manage the story left behind. In cases like this, prosecutors don't need a confession. They just need the timeline to hold. And by March 14th, it did. By the third week of March 2025, financial records had become a central pillar of the case. Not speculation, not theory, just transactions. And those numbers laid out a different kind of violence. Quieter, slower, but intentional. Kristen Chavez had opened a secondary checking account on February 9th, less than 5 weeks before her death. The account was with a separate credit union, one that did not have shared access with her existing household account. Internal logs showed she initiated it from her work desktop during her lunch break. No joint name. No linked debit card issued to anyone but her. Within 24 hours of opening the account, Kristen set up a recurring transfer. $200 pulled from her main checking account every 3 days. These transfers were modest, deliberate enough to accumulate, small enough to avoid detection. Over the course of 3 weeks, she moved approximately $1,800 before her death. A search warrant for the Chavez household bank account, the one used jointly, revealed a parallel trend. While Kristen was quietly moving funds, that same account was being drained through routine ATM withdrawals. The withdrawals averaged $60 to $100 each, almost always conducted after midnight at gas station terminals or convenience store kiosks with no active surveillance. In total, over $3,000 in cash had been withdrawn in the same period Kristen was building her exit fund. That's not coincidence, it's counteraction. On March 5th, Kristen received an email from a loan processing company she had never contacted. The subject line was generic, loan inquiry status update, but the body referenced a $1 million application under her name. It was rejected for insufficient collateral. Kristen forwarded that email to her work address and never responded. But investigators later found the original paper application in her home, crumpled, water-stained, and unsigned. The signature block had her name in print. The handwriting did not match any of her previous legal documents. A forensic document examiner brought in by Harris County confirmed the discrepancy. Forged signature, likely written by someone with regular access to her personal identification. Though forgery charges weren't immediately filed, the implication was serious. The loan was submitted using Kristen's credentials without her verified consent. The person who submitted it stood to gain financially if it had gone through. What stood out in the digital analysis was that Kristen had been searching for information related to asset protection in divorce and how to remove a spouse from joint accounts in the final weeks before her death. These weren't idle curiosities. They were functional searches, targeted, specific. She had also bookmarked 2 local attorneys, one of whom confirmed Kristen had scheduled an initial consultation for March 13th, the day after her body was discovered. These weren't desperate acts. They were structured. The clearest evidence came from a draft spreadsheet recovered from Kristen's cloud storage. Titled simply Plan A, it listed projected expenses for the next 3 months. Rent on a small apartment, food, utilities, and pet care. It included a note, temporary arrangement, will reassess by June. That file was last edited on March 10th. Investigators did not recover any text or email directly confronting the financial situation. There was no message saying I'm leaving, no confrontation thread. What Kristen had built instead was quiet distance, fiscally, legally, logistically, enough to make a clean break if she had survived long enough to take it. This was a person preparing to leave with minimal disruption, no threats, no declarations, just action. The financial picture, by the time it was reconstructed, showed dual intent. Kristen wanted out, and someone else wanted in, on her credit, her signature, her financial stability. Her silence may have bought her a few weeks of time, but it didn't buy her safety. By March 20th, prosecutors had enough to formally allege motive based on financial exploitation. The forged loan application became a cornerstone, not because of the dollar amount, but because of what it represented: control leverage through deception and an attempt to access money that Kristen had already begun taking back. Sometimes what people steal isn't just money, it's time, opportunity, autonomy. Kristen tried to protect hers, carefully, rationally. She just ran out of time. By March 14th, 2025, Chance Chavez was no longer just a person of interest. He was the only person who had both access and opportunity. But when investigators sat down with him for formal questioning at the Harris County Sheriff's Office, they encountered a man who spoke in fragments, then stopped altogether. The first recorded session lasted just under 18 minutes. Chavez confirmed his identity, provided his address, and recited his date of birth. Beyond that, his responses to nearly every material question were either, "I don't know," or "I already told you." When asked to walk investigators through the events of the morning, He repeated a general claim. He had woken up, found Kristen unconscious, and called 911. He denied touching her, denied moving her, denied striking her. He did not ask to see an attorney, but offered no new information. When pressed about the location of the dogs, he hesitated for the first time. One investigator noted a subtle shift in posture, eyes down, hands clenched. Still, he gave no direct answer. When confronted with surveillance footage placing Kristen's SUV on Katy Freeway during the disposal window, Chavez paused and said only, "That's not me driving." That was the last voluntary sentence he offered that day. In total, 3 interviews were attempted over the course of 2 days. Chavez declined to participate after the first. When investigators tried again, he refused to leave his cell. A court order was obtained to compel appearance. During the 3rd session, he was physically present, but completely nonverbal. This behavior raised procedural questions. Chavez had not formally invoked his right to counsel. He had not entered a plea. Yet he had withdrawn from interaction entirely. Mental health evaluators were brought in to assess his competency. After a preliminary screening, he was deemed fit to proceed. No evidence of active psychosis, no prior mental health diagnosis on file, no medication prescribed. The decision not to speak can't be forced, but it carries weight, particularly when it's paired with contradictory forensic evidence. At the time of his arrest, Chavez had blood residue on both his shirt cuffs and the inside hem of his left pant leg. Laboratory analysis confirmed the blood matched Kristen's DNA profile. There was no secondary transfer pattern, no attempt to clean or wipe it. But when asked about the presence of blood, he claimed he had leaned down to check if she was breathing. Investigators knew from the spatter and angle analysis that Kristen had already been moved from the bed to the floor before law enforcement arrived. The blood at those contact points was not consistent with simple observation. It was projected, not transferred. One of the more revealing details came from the booking report. During intake, officers noted that Chavez had abrasions on his right thumb and inner wrist, minor but fresh. When asked about the injury, he said he had scraped it on the sink. Forensic investigators found no blood or tissue in or around the bathroom. In contrast, the broken edge of the steam iron, retrieved from the bedroom, contained microscopic fragments of skin consistent with a grip slip under pressure. The pattern aligned with a shallow cut to the thumb. Forensic correlation placed that injury at the moment of impact, not during a later movement. It was this inconsistency, not a confession, that became the focus of prosecutorial review. In true crime investigations, silence is not evidence of guilt, but when paired with direct contradiction by physical evidence, it can shift a jury's perception from uncertainty to reasonable inference. By March 21st, the district attorney's office filed a motion for pre-indictment detention. The justification was risk of flight and potential witness tampering. Chavez's bond was raised from $250,000 to $1 million. His public defender challenged the increase, but offered no substantial counter-evidence. At this point in the investigation, the case against Chavez was built almost entirely on forensic evidence and procedural silence. No confession, no cooperating witnesses, no direct eyewitness account. But what the case had, firmly, was physical presence, motive rooted in financial manipulation, and post-crime behavior that failed to align with any account he provided. Investigators didn't need Chavez to speak. The data already had. On March 17, 2025, 5 days after Kristen Chavez was found dead inside her home on Emma Forrest Street, a private memorial was held at a small funeral home in West Houston. The service was closed to media. No press, no cameras, just family, close friends, and a quiet row of flower arrangements at the front of the chapel. One for each of the 4 dogs Kristen once called her babies. What stood out wasn't the ceremony itself, but what happened afterward. A co-worker of Kristen's, who had noticed her recent withdrawals and quiet tension at the office, posted a short tribute online. Just a photo of Kristen holding her dogs captioned, "We miss the signs. She didn't make it loud." The post went viral in less than 48 hours, not because Kristen was famous, but because the context was too familiar. Kristen's death ignited a wider discussion in Houston about coercive control and financial abuse, terms that, for many, still lack legal clarity in Texas. Advocacy groups began calling for greater recognition of non-physical abuse in domestic partnerships, particularly when victims face entrapment through joint accounts, debt manipulation, or credit dependency. By the end of March, two local nonprofits reported a spike in hotline calls specifically referencing hidden financial control. And quietly behind the headlines, a legislative staffer confirmed that a state senator had requested a draft review of how coercive control laws were being applied in other jurisdictions, including California and New York. No bill was filed, not yet, but the impact was measurable. Kristen's family released a single statement. She didn't scream for help. That doesn't mean she was safe. If silence is someone's only strategy, it means the system has already failed. Meanwhile, the legal process moved forward. Chance Chavez remained in custody at Harris County Jail, charged with murder in the first degree. Prosecutors cited financial motive, forensic inconsistencies, and post-crime manipulation of the scene. A grand jury indicted him on March 22nd. His bond, originally set at $250,000, was raised to $1,000. He did not appear at his initial court hearing, requiring law enforcement to forcibly escort him from his holding cell. His defense team filed no motions for dismissal. As of June 29, 2025, no trial date has been set. With no confession and no eyewitness, the state's case rests entirely on forensic and digital evidence. The timeline, blood pattern, injury sequencing, banking records, document forgery, cell tower data, and animal disposal strategy, all independently verified, all submitted for pretrial discovery. Prosecutors have not announced whether they will pursue life imprisonment or capital punishment. That decision is still pending, but the court of public awareness has moved faster than the legal one. In the weeks following Kristen's death, several women came forward with similar stories about joint bank accounts being drained without consent, about being removed from shared leases, about financial paperwork filed behind their backs. None of them made headlines, but the advocacy network started tracking patterns. Kristen's story didn't just reveal a violent moment, it exposed a series of quiet systems that enabled someone else to gain control of her choices, her finances, and ultimately, her life. She didn't leave behind a diary. There was no dramatic voicemail. What she left were spreadsheets, Google searches, a lawyer appointment, and 4 dogs, 3 of them still alive, being fostered together by a local rescue volunteer. That in itself tells you who she was. Quiet, methodical, careful, planning her way out rather than exploding her way through. Some victims scream, others vanish. Kristen planned and died with the file still open on her desktop. Her case will likely be prosecuted sometime in late 2025 or early 2026. But the cultural shift began the moment her silence was interrupted, not by a call for help, but by the people who looked back and finally understood what had been there all along. Sometimes justice doesn't begin with punishment. It begins with recognition, and sometimes the loudest case is the one where no one ever raised their voice. Maybe Kristen never got the chance to speak her truth out loud, but that doesn't mean we can't hear it now. If there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's that silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's survival. And when someone you love grows quieter, don't just listen for words. Look for signs. Ask questions. Pay attention. This case reminded me that abuse doesn't always leave bruises. It can hide in the fine print, in shared bank accounts, in the slow erasure of someone's choices. That's why we tell these stories, not just to remember the victim, but to recognize the patterns before they become fatal. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you or someone you know ever seen financial control disguised as love? What steps do you think our communities can take to protect people like Kristen before it's too late? If this video spoke to your heart or opened your eyes, drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from or share your perspective. And hey, if you didn't like it, tell me why. Your feedback helps us grow. If this story mattered to you, subscribe to the channel. There are more real stories coming, stories that need to be heard.